Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Welcome back to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm Michael Sirmon. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever found yourself making a decision and suddenly wondered, wait a minute, do I actually want this? Not because it's a bad decision and not because it's harmful, but because somewhere deep down you aren't sure whether the desire came from you or from someone else's expectations. Maybe it was a career path. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was a ministry role or a leadership position, a financial goal, or possibly even your life plan. You followed the path because it seemed right, because it was expected, because everyone around you approved of it. But one day you stopped and wondered, whose life am I actually living? And that's what we're going to talk about today, the voices we borrow, the expectations we inherit, and how those voices can quietly shape our lives without us ever realizing it. Because we all receive an invisible inheritance. Most of us inherit far more than our genetics. We inherit stories, beliefs, assumptions, expectations, messages about success, messages about failure, messages about who we are supposed to overcome. And some of those are helpful, but some are not. The challenge is that we rarely stop long enough to separate them. We simply absorb them. A parent says, "Ooh, a good provider works hard." A teacher says, "Your value comes from achievement." A coach says, "Winning is what matters." And a company says, "Your title will define your success." The American culture especially says, "More is always better." Social media says everybody is always ahead of you. And before long, those messages become internalized, not because we intentionally adopted them, but because we've heard them long enough that they started sounding like our own voice. And that's the danger. Because the voices we borrow will almost always become the voices we obey. And if we're not careful, those expectations then will become part of our identity or will become our identity. One of the greatest challenges I see in coaching leaders isn't a lack of capability, and you hear me say that a lot, but it's confusion. Highly successful people are those who often have accumulated very impressive things, but secretly, they don't know who they are anymore. They've become so accustomed to meeting expectations that they no longer understand what they actually want. They know what their boss wants. They know what their spouse wants. They know what the investors want. They know what their teams want. They know what the customers want. They know what society wants from them. But ask them what they truly believe. Ask them what matters most. Ask them what kind of life they want to build. And many of them are going to struggle to answer. Now, often they will give you a quick response that sounds very confident, that sounds exactly like something that they have rehearsed and they've convinced themselves of. But when they slow down and get quiet and they give themselves space to think and be honest with themselves, then it becomes more of a challenge for them to answer. Because somewhere along the way, expectations became their identity. I know I've lived that. And once that happens, every decision then becomes heavier because they're no longer choosing what's right. They're choosing which voice gets to win. And the competing voices can be exhausting. I mean, think about how many voices compete for your attention every day. One voice says work harder. One voice says slow down. One says chase the opportunity. One says always stay safe. One says provide more. One says take the challenge. One says be more present. Another one says work more. Another one says take the promotion. Another says protect your peace. One says serve everyone. Another says establish your boundaries. When I was at my first day of basic training when I went in the Army, I remember I got off the bus and I was probably 2 hours into the first day of hell, where it was, just up, downs, push-ups. It was, you name it, it was horrible. And at one point, I boldly declared I was doing no more push-ups. And, it's funny because I was 100% wrong. And I immediately gave the rest of my company a break because every drill sergeant was on me at that moment. I had one on each side of me, and all four of them were yelling for attention, yelling for me to look at them and pay attention to them. And I'm constantly reminded in life that happens a lot. We have so many things yelling, asking us and demanding that we look at them, and we forget about the goal that we actually started looking for when it all began. The problem isn't that the voices in our lives that are yelling for attention exist. The problem is that we give them all equal authority, and that's what gets exhausting. The four drill sergeants, I gave them all equal authority, when really the one that mattered was my drill sergeant. What I learned then and what I've reminded of in, every day of my life is that, we can't, no human can satisfy every expectation. No matter how hard you try, someone will always think you should do more. Someone will always think you should do less. Someone will always think you're too ambitious. Someone will think you're not ambitious enough. Someone will applaud your choices. Some will criticize them. In management and in politics, what I learned quickly was every decision is going to make somebody mad and make somebody happy. So I had to make the decision that was the best decision based off what I knew for the direction we were going and what the end goal was, and forget about the popularity contest piece of it. Right? I think too many of us were living our lives like it's all a popularity contest. And the people that aren't mad at you, the risk is they also don't respect you. Now, sometimes the ones that are mad at me are the ones that actually respect me. Because I made a decision, I stood on the decision, they didn't agree with it, but they knew I stood for something. So if our peace depends on satisfying every voice, then peace will always remain out of our reach. Because approval is a trap. For many of us, the deepest borrowed voice within us is for approval. We want to be liked. We want to be accepted. We want people to think well of us, and that's normal. That's human. In fact, I've told this story to several people in my life. As a young man in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, I always wanted a pierced ear. Don't know why, but for some reason I wanted one. But that was not something that was accepted in our household. So I grew up, I went to the military, came home, got married, I was pastoring a church, and we were out having dinner with some friends, and out of the blue, this friend, Kevin, my best friend, he said, "Hey, if you could do anything in the world right now, what would you do?" And I hadn't thought about it for years, but the first thing that popped out of my mouth was get my ear pierced. And he started laughing. He said, "Really?" "Well, no, what would you do?" I said, "I would get my ear pierced. I've always let fear stop me from piercing my ear." So we left because they happen to own a beauty shop / spa. And we left and went to their business, and we all pierced our ear. And I remember mine was a beautiful black onyx stud. But we were in church the next morning, and we're doing the receiving line, and we're pastoring an Indian mission. And as these greeting everybody to come through, and this little old lady, she's walking by, and she shakes my hand, and she walks on, and she stops, and she looks back, and she said, "I despise men with pierced ears." And she hesitated a minute, and then she said, "But it looks good on you." And then she turned and left. Now, I didn't keep the earring long because I played with it and got infected, and then I just let it grow back up because I found out it wasn't important to me to have it as much as it was about doing it. Because when I did it, I didn't know it, but there was like a band of fear that was around me about what if people rejected me, what if they didn't like me anymore and all this stuff. But just doing that simple act of pushing through that boundary of fear broke open a lot of things. My preaching got better. My decision-making got better. My leadership got better. I was more comfortable with myself. Because what I didn't realize was that the approval was very dangerous because it was driving my decisions. And because it was just driving my decisions, I wasn't taking the risks sometimes I needed to take. I wasn't choosing the more difficult decisions sometimes because I was afraid of being out on that island by myself. But what I've learned over the years is that approval is a moving target. The people we're trying to satisfy today may change their expectations tomorrow. And if your identity extends or depends on this external validation, then you're going to spend your entire life chasing something that you can never fully secure. And I know because I've done it. And I'm sure, or maybe you've done it too. Trying to be everything for everyone, trying not to disappoint anyone, trying to manage perceptions, trying to earn acceptance. Only discover that the more approval you chase, the further clarity seems to drift away. One of the things I find remarkable about Jesus is how often he disappointed expectations. Think about it. The religious leaders expected one thing from him. The political leaders expected another. The crowds wanted something entirely different. As a matter of fact, even his closest followers often misunderstood what he was doing. Now, if he had tried to satisfy every expectation around him, he would not have fulfilled his purpose. But instead, he remained anchored in his purpose. Not because everyone agreed with him and not because everyone approved of him, but because he knew whose voice mattered the most. In fact, in John 5:30, Jesus said, "I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me." There was clarity, there was alignment, there was purpose. Not because the noise disappeared, but because he knew which voice carried authority. So the lesson isn't that we're going to stop listening to people. The lesson is that we're going to stop giving every voice equal weight. And let's be clear, this isn't a call to become rebellious, because some people hear messages like this and they think, oh, the answer is reject everyone's influence. That's not wisdom. We need mentors. We need family. We need coaches. We need trusted friends. We need spiritual guidance. So the goal isn't independence. The goal is discernment. Discernment asks which voice deserves influence, which voices deserve authority, and which voices am I carrying long after they've stopped serving me? And that's a completely different question. Because maturity isn't learning to ignore everyone. Maturity is learning who to listen to and when. So here's a practical exercise I'd encourage you to try. Think about an area of your life where you feel tension. Maybe it's work, maybe it's family, maybe it's in your faith. Maybe it's a major decision you've been facing. But then ask yourself, what voices are influencing this decision? And write them down. Be honest with yourself. Could it be family expectations? Could it be past experiences? Could it be fear, social pressure, financial concerns, personal desires, your faith convictions, everything? Write them all down. Then ask a second question. Which of these voices have actually earned the right to guide me? And that's where your clarity will begin. Not when every voice disappears, but when you recognize which voices deserve a seat at the table. So as we finish today, I want to leave you with 4 questions. Which voice do I fear disappointing most? What belief am I carrying that may actually be mine? What decision would I make if approval wasn't part of the equation? And whose voice matters most when all the others grow quiet? Because freedom doesn't come from pleasing everyone. Freedom comes from knowing who you are. Freedom comes from recognizing which voices deserve your attention and which ones don't. Freedom comes when you stop borrowing convictions that were never yours to begin with. And perhaps most importantly, freedom comes when you finally learn to recognize the voice of God above all the noise. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Lead Well, Live Whole. If today's conversation resonated with you, I'd encourage you to share it with someone who may be carrying expectations that were never theirs to carry. And be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you're listening, because it will help more people discover the show and join the conversation. And if you'd like more leadership insights, articles, coaching resources, or encouragement, visit me at michaelsirmon.com. So until next time, lead well, live whole. And remember, not every voice deserves authority in your life.